What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde, and boy, do we have a special guest. Dr. Pamela Cantor is in the house. What's up, Dr. Pamela?
Very glad to be here.
Oh my God. I'm so excited to have you here. Before we get started, do you mind if I do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll get going?
Sounds great.
All right, let's do it. So for listeners who are new to the show, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. People are living their passions and those creating greatness in the world and doing so despite the odds. And Dr. Pamela is neither short of passion or greatness. So before the show started, I said, all right, you're a renowned doctor. I don't want to not call you doctor because some doctors like to be called doctor, but she said, call me Pam. So from this moment forward, Pam, if you're cool with it, I'm going to call you doctor. It's like, or I'm going to call you Pam. Does that work?
That works.
Thumbs up. All right. She could pronounce my last name, guys. So I was pretty amazed by that, but we'll get into that later. Many of our guests, a lot of our guests are people that just come to me, and many from walks of life. Sometimes they'll come to me when I'm on social and I see them and there's something that they did or said. They're on some sort of podcast or they're on some sort of show and it resonated with me. And I've learned over the last 4 years of doing the show that it's a pretty high bar for me to like go and start attacking someone. We have a list of maybe 200 people that were always out there bothering, and Pam was on that list. And my team did a good job. I finally saw her book, and I was like, yes, she booked. So so glad to have you here. If you don't mind, Pam, I'd love to give your formal bio for our audience that may or may not be familiar with your work. Does that work for you?
That's perfect.
All right. So you guys, we have Dr. Pamela Cantor here. She's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, author of Whole Child Development, Learning and Thriving, as well as The Science of Learning and Development. And you can, if you guys want to learn more about her work, we're going to be talking a lot about this during the show, but she's written tons of great stuff on child development. And you can go to her website, www.pamelacantormd.com. We'll put that in the show notes and we'll talk more about that. I keep wanting to call you Dr. Pamela. I'm gonna quit reading. Pam, if you wouldn't mind, our audience loves origin stories. Would you mind giving our audience a little bit of your origin story? How did you get to where you got to?
So, like many people, sometimes your toughest moment becomes the thing that gives you your greatest strength. So my toughest moments have a lot to do with having been sexually abused as a little girl by a family member. And the worst part of that was that my parents felt that I had to bury it and not ever talk about it to anybody. And I did that, and it kind of took apart my entire childhood and my relationship to them. When I finally did get help, I was a teenager, and a pretty complicated teenager, and worked with somebody who he called me a pearl in an oyster, not this ugly, dirty thing that I thought I was. And it was a big day when I marched into his office after the help he gave me and told him I was going to become a doctor. And if not for him and not for how he saw me and what he saw in me, that never would have happened. So the life-changing experience of becoming a doctor so that I could understand how I became who I became was the life-changing experience for me.
Wow. I might have missed this, but how old were you when that happened?
5.
Wow. I'm so sorry. That's crazy. It's amazing. By the way, I didn't know if I caught this. Do you have children? You're a mother and grandmother, so I'm assuming you have children. Is that right?
Can I tell you my tribe?
Yeah. Give me your tribe.
5 married kids.
Whoa.
18 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren.
Whoa. I'm so jealous right
And
now.
I'm a spring chicken, in case it's not obvious to you.
Yeah.
So,
Would you start having kids like before you went to college? I mean, come on.
no, I married a man who was somewhat older than me, and he came with 12 of the grandchildren that we grew to 18.
Wow.
And they loved their lives, so they're procreating like crazy.
I love that. That's amazing. Um, Now, the reason I asked that is, we talked a little bit before the show, and we'll get into it more in the show. But one of the reasons that I asked you to be on the show is, I'm a person that's, I would say a very overly curious person, or a very curious person, and I grew up in a family that was a mixed family. My father was from Iran, my mother was from Western Pennsylvania. My dad came here for grad school in the 70s. And then his life fell apart when when the revolution happened in Iran. We were living there, and he came back a really angry person. And my dad, there was a dichotomy of his behavior, which was, I see it in myself, in that there was rage, and he was also a very loving person. Which when you're a kid of that, that's a really awkward. That's a hard thing to digest, because you're like, the person loves you, but the rage is like unbearable, right? And so unfortunately, that created a lot of chaos in my home, and I dealt with it in some interesting ways that we'll talk about as the show goes on. But when it really came to life for me, a lot of the trauma that I experienced as a kid was when I had kids and I saw them, and I was like, oh shit, I was that age when this really traumatic thing happened. And it was that mirror for me that was like, I think before then I was able to just kind of dismiss it or push it down or not think about it, and it came out in its own ways. But that was when it was front and center for me. So when you started having kids, obviously you went to a psychologist, psychiatrist when you were young to deal with these issues. Was it more poignant when you became a mother? Was it something that, or were you already in the field at that point and already had dealt with it?
No, I was already in the field, because I was a child psychiatrist by that time, or at least a child psychiatrist in training. But here's what I saw. I remember the night I gave birth, and I remember thinking, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with this baby. I also remember that I was alone. My mother wasn't in the room with me or helping me. And I remember asking that therapist I talked to you about, how does somebody learn how to be a mother? And he said this thing that actually scared me. He said, they learn it from how they were mothered. And I started to cry, and I said, well, I'm in big trouble, because I don't think I was mothered. And he said, well, a part of what I've been doing with you is mothering you. And the rest you're going to learn, just like you just said, Darius. You're going to learn it by being a mother to this little boy. So I was far from perfect at it. I got better with time, and learned how to mother, and learned how to grandmother, and learned a whole lot about mothering. Yeah. But I was not mothered. Yeah,
it's interesting. I've never heard it termed that way. So, and I'm kind of internalizing it right now, like how was I as far as mothered or fathered, right? Like I thought my mom is actually, she's an LCSW, and so she's a therapist, right? So I grew up with a mom who's a therapist and an entrepreneur who was a dad, and I thought my mom was actually, she was victim of some of this violence too. So just to see that perspective, and then to see how it kind of translated into my own becoming a parent. Yeah, it's just something that's been super eye opening for me. So I was curious how that worked for you. And that's a gift, though, to have that therapist, to have cared enough to do that for you.
Well, I told you that one of the things I did was listened to you on Front Row Dad. And of course, that story of yelling at your 6-year-old and feeling the anger come out of you, and realizing in the moment what was going on for you, was one of the most powerful moments in that podcast. And it made me think about you and how you brought about the healing that allowed you, first of all, to see this and to say, I don't want that to be me. Mm-hmm. And then how you progressively used your own reflective capacities, your own curiosity, so many strengths that you have, to say, I'm going to change this. So what I related to so powerfully in it is that we can change as humans. We can become who we want to become. And this is what my whole professional and scientific life is dedicated to, which is to help the world understand that actually biologically, psychologically, in the cells, we are capable of profound kinds of change. We are wired for change. But we have to bring it about either with the help of an important relationship or by many of the tools that you used to change you into who you became.
What do you, I would love your opinion on this, because we're closer in age than probably most people like who are listening to this show might think. I'm 45 years old, even though you're a great grandmother. Like I'm,
you're my hero, Darius.
Well, I say that because even if our age gap is wider than supports that, my father was born in 1939 in Iran. My grandfather was born in 29 in Italy. And I always joked, I'm like, look, those are the two male figures out of my life. And my grandmother was from the Great Depression, and my mom was a child of the parents, right? And so I'm like, if you're born in 1939 in Iran, I'm born in 1978. That's like being born in like the 1800s in the United States. So there's this like punitive, like kids are meant to be put to work. Like there's no like dad throwing ball in the backyard shit. That did not exist in my household. Like my dad was not my friend. He was like the manager, and he was not a friendly manager. And so I grew up with this hardcore, like kind of like first, second generation environment that like the kids were meant to be toughened up hard. And like I remember that was a big part of my childhood. Was I was reading Angela Duckworth's book about grit, and I was like, oh yeah, that's like dude, my parents, like their version of creating grittiness was insane. So I say all that because I feel like there's this revolution that's happened from like a psychological perspective of caring about how people feel and expressing your feelings and having empathy towards trauma and all this stuff that like is part of the zeitgeist of today. That was like nowhere on like my radar until I became an adult. And I think that I feel like I'm the last generation. I'm like end of Gen X, right? Where like, like we were just kind of thrown out to the wolves and and whatever happened. A lot of bad stuff happened, right? And there was not a lot of empathy for it when we were kids growing up. And now it's, people are dealing with it as adults. Do you have any thoughts around this, having grown up in a time where, like, to your point, your parents were like, yeah, we don't talk about this. Whereas now it's like, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm sure there's families where it's like, we don't talk about this, but I also feel like there's a lot of talk around that you should be dealing with these problems and feelings and things that happen to you as a, trauma as a child. And that I just felt like wasn't there before. I don't know. Maybe this is just my own story, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I can promise you it's not just your own story. So let me give you and our listeners one life-altering scientific fact. Okay, and that is that there was a day that I was sitting in a medical school class, and the professor said this. He said that all of us have about 20,000 genes in our genome, but in our lifetime, fewer than 10% of those genes are going to get expressed. So I sat there thinking about that, and I said, well, what's in the 10%? And how do you determine that? And he said, it's context. The relationships, environments, and experiences of your life are going to determine what in your DNA, what in your genetic endowment gets expressed. So when we think about the experiences kids have, the tough love that you're talking about, the much more relational, emotional picture of parenting that exists today. What we're talking about are the experiences that are going to either reveal the potential inside of us or shut it down. Our DNA gets read because of an interaction between experience and our genetic capabilities. So when you use the phrase, or when I use the phrase human potential, I am talking about what is in me that I want to bring into this world, the best of me, how we become who we become. It all depends on context, experience, relationships. Now, this was not believed in the 20th century. We didn't design our schools for this. We didn't parent for this. This knowledge didn't exist at the beginning of the 20th century. But the field that exists today that houses this knowledge is a field called epigenetics. Epi is what is above the genes. So the driver to genetic expression is experience. So that means that the things you've done in your life to change the experience your kids have, the things I did in my life to learn how to mother, okay, that's what we have control over. Mm-hmm. We have agency if we choose to have it. So this idea is you can be ambitious and you can be a good dad. Yeah, that is true. And in doing that, you can bring a very, very different kind of experience to the people who work for you or the children you raise.
I love that. You just had me I was thinking of, it was actually the first thing on my list was to talk about your thoughts on epigenetics. So you beat me to the punch. I'm reading I think it's Lifespan by Dave Sinclair right now. Mm-hmm. And he talks a lot about epigenetics and just for listeners, just to even relate even more, the way he describes it, I think is really interesting, which is our DNA is like a digital file and the epigenetics is an analog file, right? So think of it as like a, MP3 versus a record, right? And this is you can't change that digital file that's inside your body, but you can change the what speaker it comes out of. You can change the record, you can change the physical thing that is happening to it, and then it'll, I guess, reflect differently. Is that what you're saying essentially?
What I'm saying is that the record is very big, and what determines what gets expressed in your life are chemical changes that are brought about by experiences. So let me just describe one chemical and you'll see what I mean. There's a hormone in the body called oxytocin. Its nickname is that it's the love hormone. Oxytocin has enormous effects on our brains and the development of our brains. But oxytocin has huge effects on what aspects of our DNA are going to get read. So when we have these relationships of empathy, of understanding, of somebody deeply knowing us and caring about us and trusting, a person that we deeply trust, we are setting up the conditions where the best in us can come out. Now, if that same child is treated punitively, is growing up without a sense of belonging, without a sense of safety, the creativity in that child may not come out. Okay, and many, many kids, I will tell you, who have childhoods like yours, their creativity and their possibility, there are barriers. So how you surmounted that and how you became a person that, in spite of all of that, was going to find a way to unlock this, I'm sure that there are people who came into your life along the way that are a factor in that. Mm. And then there are things that about you, the fact that you are a reflective human. I mean, those things are incredibly powerful tools.
It was interesting, like, and I don't disagree with what you just said. I struggled actually. Even to this day, with people like, who's your like mentors or heroes growing up, and my answer was me. Like I didn't. Mm-hmm. I said I don't have any person that's my hero, right? Like I didn't have anyone I looked up to. I just kind of depended on myself. And I remember, which I think is, it was obviously a good thing to get through a very, I think, tumultuous childhood. But I think there's side effects of that, though. And I felt like if a lot of times people say like, oh, childhood's around freedom and fun, and you can do whatever you want, and you have no responsibilities. I'm like, I didn't feel that way at all. I felt like I was kind of an adult at a young age. So so how do when you're dealing with kids that are in these like hard environments, and interestingly enough, like my family was pretty like well off. Like there was money was a non-issue. Like it didn't feel that way. My dad was very scarcity mindset, but it wasn't like I was living in poverty. It wasn't like I was living in, like I clothes on my back, and I'm like, I lived in an upper middle class area. So like those things were all like taken care of. So I was lucky to have that. But emotionally, it was hard, right? And growing up around a kind of a violent upbringing. And so when people come, so I do think that it comes in different shapes and sizes, like how people's experiences are. Like you can have money and be in a really abusive environment, right? But when kids come in and you see that there's like a mini adult there, because I've seen the opposite. My kids are like pure love and joy, and like they're kids, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like, and I see it, I'm like, oh man, I was not that. I like, how do you, as a doctor, how do you approach that? How do you think about that?
Every patient, every child I ever saw came in with kind of an outer shell. And I used to imitate sort of how they would look, where they would sit like this. And there would be this, tremendous, like, you can't tell me anything I don't already know. I mean, the hardened shell was there in 100% of the people that I worked with. So, I mean, my job was to figure out how to get inside, how to get into a place where ultimately they trusted me. Sometimes it took years. Okay, the interesting thing about me in terms of that therapist I've talked about is that it didn't take years. It barely took minutes. I was so starved by the time I met him for somebody who thought I was worth something that it's literally, you had me at hello. But that wasn't my experience when I became a doctor. When I became a doctor, I learned that the art of being a therapist is how you melt resistance and turn it into trust. That's the art of being a good or a great therapist. Does it always happen? No. But for me, it happened the vast majority of the time. But sometimes it could take years. Sometimes it could take a month. But it's the work.
Yeah.
And until you get to trust, there's not a whole lot else that you can do.
What do you think? I have two questions for you, because a part of me is approaching this from an adult looking back, right? And part of me is, wanting to educate the audience, is looking at this as a parent with my own kids, right? And I think anyone that's listening is either going to reflect one of two ways. They're going to say like, man, I had a great childhood. Like, I don't know what Darius is talking about or Pam's talking about. And I hope no one really thinks that, but potentially they will. Hopefully everyone had a great childhood, but I hope that they can at least embrace that we're having a vulnerable conversation. The other side of this is going to be like, well, how do I know if my kids need help in this way, right? And so I'd like to start on the first part, which is, when you start to think of yourself, in your field, and your expertise is around working with children, and an adult who's listening to this, how might they reconcile? Because I think that some people, again, depending on their own natural reflectiveness, their ability to dig deep, their ability to try to want to problem solve versus just like leave it in the unconscious, right? How might someone know that, oh, I have something I need to go work on that originated when I was young and that I haven't worked on it? Like, what would be a telltale sign of that from your perspective?
Sure. So let's imagine that this parent, the adult that you're talking about, provided what they thought was a good childhood for their kids. And let's say they didn't come from a fully great childhood, but they're very proud of the fact that they did something different for their child. Now this child is struggling, maybe struggling in school, maybe being bullied by peers, maybe not doing well in school. And this parent is thinking, but I've provided everything that you need. Okay, I provided you all the things I didn't have. And that parent at that moment is not listening to what their child is telling them. The barrier that's getting in the way is themselves. They think that they created the childhood where nothing should go wrong. And the fact is, in childhood and in development, things go wrong.
Right.
So a narcissistic defense says, everything should be fine. I gave you this, I gave you that, I gave you the other. A non-narcissistic approach would be to want to hear that child's experience of their life, which may be hard to hear, which may make that parent feel that they didn't do a good enough job. And that may be very tough for that parent to take in. But the quality of listening is one of the biggest things that any parent can do for a child, because the quality of listening makes that child feel, I can tell you anything. You're in my corner.
Yeah.
And I don't have to worry about that. You create that feeling, and any problem can be solved with that child. But it's the quality of listening that is the key.
Oh, I really appreciate that. What do you think when you start thinking of like even this interaction we're talking about right now? You just made me think of as an adult again. Like, and I didn't tell you this. So my father died when I was 22 years old, and my grandfather, who was this like, my grandfather, who was the old Italian guy at this point when my dad died. But even growing up, he was someone who was around a lot, but was not fun to be around. I think he was molested when he was a kid in Italy, and I think he hated men. So I was around a lot of men haters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a theme. I didn't even realize as much till I grew up, because in my mom, in some ways, that way. And so he was very like I look at how I am with my kids, and I'm like, there was no man in my life like that. So I had no men that I looked up to. And my dad was hypercritical. My grandfather was hypercritical. That made my mom in some ways critical. And so it wasn't until I was probably in my 20s and 30s where I started to gain some friends who were older than I was, and one of my friends in particular, he's probably in his mid 70s now, 30 years older than me, business mentor, but we started talking a lot about life. And he's always asking me about my kids, and he's always just giving me this like kind of just like passerby advice. He said, Darius, the number one advice I give parents, I didn't even ask for it. It was just like unsolicited, but it was always great, and it's always valuable. He said, the number one advice I always give parents if they want to have a great relationship with their kids is don't criticize your kids. And it was funny. The second he said it, I was like, excuse my language right now. I was like, fuck. When all I did was get criticized, my whole life. And I realized it made me hate my parent, like whoever that was doing it. I did not like them. I was like, I don't want to be around them. I, in some cases, hated them. It made it where I had people in my life when they passed away. I'm like, I don't care. Like, great. Now I don't have to deal with them anymore. And I realized that that's a callous thing to say, but that came from decades of just negative interactions. So when you start to think of like what you just said right now around building trust, and this idea of not criticizing your kids, because I think it's hard, because I think people want the best for their kids, and again, you learn to parent from your parents, and maybe your parents were people that criticized, right? How do you think about that? How do you think of this? Well, like, is there constructive criticisms? What are your thoughts on that?
So I actually didn't say not to criticize. I did talk about the quality of listening. And the essential place of trust. But all of us need someone in our lives who is going to hold up a mirror and help us see something that might be a hard truth. If we do not have those kinds of people, there are all kinds of strengths we will never build to deal with and navigate in the real world. Because the world is going to throw curveballs and challenges and negative stuff at us. So how are we going to figure out how to handle the message and the messenger? So knowing how to tell the truth to a young person that is difficult, like they tell you a situation and you see that some part of what happened to them, they triggered, but they can't see it. They just see they're a victim. They just see what others were doing. The person in their life that can actually tell them, this is a picture of what's happening. What they did was wrong, but here's something that I think you brought to what just happened. I think you triggered certain things in these people, and it resulted in this thing that you see. I know that you love Mr. Miyagi. Okay? Mr. Miyagi told the truth to Daniel. He loved him. And he saw the best in him, and Daniel trusted him. But a big part of why Daniel trusted him was because he could count on him to tell him the truth. And what was going to happen to him if he didn't practice certain things, how he was going to ride through his fears and compete. He told him lots of important truths. And Daniel became a performer. I mean, a competitor. And so the people in our life that get us to those high levels of performance in sports, in academics, whatever it is, they're people who tell us the truth in ways that are sufficiently kind that we can keep our minds open. But the truth is there. Unmistakably, the truth is there.
Wow. You just made me realize that Mr. Miyagi was actually one of my mentors growing up. I was 6 years old when that movie came out.
Mine too.
Yeah. I love him. I have a
Love
picture.
him.
There's a picture behind me of him signed. I don't know if you can see that. My wife got that for me like 20 years ago. But wow. I love that. What gosh, I have so many questions. One of the things that I, having grown up, and so let's go to the other side of this, which is having kids. And I'm going to come back to my question, because my question is really around what do you do with this type of stuff when it becomes like programmed into you? Actually, let's go to that question, because I'll forget it if I don't.
Okay.
So look, you deal with these. We don't get to pick our families or our parents or our upbringings. We can just choose to do work with what we got, right? To your point, like 50% of this is born in us, and 50% of it is how do we choose to work with it through our epigenetics. And so when we start thinking of that, and obviously, again, we don't get to choose our upbringing, we get to choose how we react to it. But a lot of my sense is, at least from my own experiences, a lot of programming comes out of that. A lot of protectionary programming comes out of it. In my case, it was high alert, anxious, perfectionism. Those were three big ones. And fear, right? And then making sure that perfection doesn't happen, so that I didn't have to be fearful of stuff, right? And over time, what I found was, and I'm probably going to use the wrong science here, but I feel like there was these neural pathways that got created, and then some impulse reactions, and then I would get filled with anxiety and whatever serotonin response, and or what was the cortisol response, and that became like comfort for me in a negative way. Where I'm like, okay, that's just how I deal with it, and I'm always on high alert. And then when things are good, I'm not on high alert. But the minute I sense problems, I'm back on high alert. And over time, I was like, I didn't realize, but I'm like, man, I have chronic anxiety, and I'm tired. And it took me a couple decades, about 4, to get tired of it, and to then go and start doing the work. But how does one, like, again, someone that's, and everyone has their own issues and their own things that they're working through. But I guess the point I'm getting at is, when you get these neural pathways, it takes time for them to form. And these responses to these different, stimuli take time to form. But yet here we are in a point where you're like, man, I'm tired of that. I want to, I didn't ask for that when I was 6 or 5 or 10 or whenever it happened. I'm now dealing with it. How do you go about like trying to reprogram a human, if you will? And that's the way I started thinking about it, because to actually get the results we want, which is, hey, I can't control what happened. I can only control how I respond to it now. And I think there's a bit of reprogramming that needs to happen in order to like not have those same responses. How do you think about that as a doctor?
Well, I think that you are 100% right about what has to happen. But I think most people don't realize why it can happen, why we are wired for that. So first of all, our brain is an electrical structure. And as an electrical structure, it is influenced by chemicals, by neurotransmitters, like you talked about cortisol. I've talked about oxytocin, serotonin is in there. There's another important one, dopamine, which we'll talk about. But this is the soup that our brain is bathed in as we are developing. And under the age of 5, that formation of how the brain gets wired is exquisitely sensitive to contextual factors, for good or bad. So when bad things happen, that wiring gets programmed just the way that you're talking about. One of the best books on that subject is The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. If you read that book, you will see how lives very, very young can get imprinted. But the good news is that the brain is malleable. It is the most malleable structure, the most susceptible to change of any structure in the human body. Literally, it is wired for change. So had you done the work starting earlier, you would have prevented some of how life felt to you living on high alert. The earlier one starts to do that reprogramming, the better. But I do think one of the more surprising things to people is how far into one's life that plasticity holds, meaning we are malleable well into adulthood. It makes us able to change well into adulthood. And there were things that you said, again, in that podcast, you said, lead with love. Okay, well, when you decided to do that you were going to put love into the world, even though your stomach may have been a ball of anxiety, because of the dynamics with you and whoever you were with, you put love in the world. You got something back that wasn't rage at those moments. And that cycle is how reprogramming happens. We put something into the world in service to love, trust, and positive things. Positive things come back, and we rewire. I was rewired as a person. It took years. It wasn't fast. But the person I would have been from the childhood I had, unmothered, sexually abused, and a whole host of other things, I did not have the life anyone would have predicted for me. And from the day that I met the person who saved my life, and I knew it, that's the part I brought to the picture. I knew this man was there to save my life, and I joined with the program. But it still took years to become who I became today.
You don't have to answer this, but if you want to, I wouldn't mind. Do you, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but do you think that there's like a higher power or a God or something that put that person in your life? Or do you think that was just chance?
So I've thought about this a lot, and you'll get a kick out of this story. I once asked this person, I said, can everything that happens to us be explained? He said, no. I said, so there are mysteries about things that happen, either things that happen to us. I was thinking of extrasensory perception. I was thinking about these weird things that our mind sometimes is able to do. And he said, no, everything cannot be explained. So I have a hard time with higher powers directing. I don't even think our DNA directs us, and that's been scientifically proven. So I don't like the notion of something directing, but I also think that being able to recognize what something is in your life in the moment that it's happening to you, that's what happens when you fall in love. Okay, if you are in a good marriage and you are in love with your wife, how did that happen? So part of it is that you met her, but part of it was that you knew who she was supposed to be and you acted on it. So my late husband used to say, that's the real miracle, is that we see it in the moment and we act on it.
Yeah.
And I believe that.
Interesting. I love that answer. It's just making me think about when I met my wife. She like struck me with lightning.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. I'm gonna pull a little bit of a 180 here to go back to the. I mean, that was really cool. I like our mystical conversation. You know, I'm a bit of like I was telling you, I'm kind of a hard ass. A little bit, I'm soft too, but I grew up with, you know, like a little bit of a militant environment, you know, and some for good and some for bad. We're talking about the bad stuff. There was some good stuff that I think made me into awesome. There's some awesome things about me that came out of that hard environment that was not necessarily negative. And what I've noticed is I tend to have a little bit of for lack of a better word, like repulsion towards coddling. Like this, like coddling, and I see like that there's it just feels generational to me right now, but I feel like there's this like really coddling the kids and like people like helicopter parenting and not building resilient kids. And I see it a lot, and especially my kids. My oldest kid's 14, my son's 14, my youngest son's 10. So I watch the parents parent, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's it's their kids, they do what the heck they want with it, but it's going to be their, you know, they're going to deal with whatever the positives or negatives of that in the future, and that's their life to live. But for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, I would never do that. What are your thoughts around this culturally? Like, what's going on right now? Or do you think is this like every generation feel this way? Because I feel like every generation thinks the next generation has it easier. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, just clinically or just from your own opinion, about the state in which people are parenting right now.
I think there is something generational going on right now. Dr. Becky talks about this quite a lot. I don't know whether you ever listen to her podcast, but you should, because Dr. Becky's work is a response to the very thing that you're talking about. She came on the scene to try to give parents a way to raise their kids, to accept the responsibility that this is what they are there to do, and that they are not there only to, in your words, coddle. But she is reacting to a generation of parents who seem to have trouble holding the line with their own kids and not caving in to the demands of their kids. And so a lot of her tools that she gives to parents are responsive to the very thing you're talking about right now. Why it is that we have parents that feel that they don't understand that what they hold their kids to is helping their kids build muscles to succeed in the world.
Yeah.
And if they don't do it, the world's never going to do it with as much kindness or understanding as a good parent would. Okay, the teachers, the coaches, whoever it is. So somehow or other, this is a generational thing. There is a lot of it going on. But I think in terms of yours and my conversation, I think the key thing is that what we do to prepare our kids for the world they're walking in is our number one responsibility. And that cannot just be done with loving our kids. It's also teaching our kids. It's also holding the line on important things. and learning how to do it.
What do you think, about how core values play into that, or promoting core values? I feel like the world has gotten a lot bigger and a lot more decentralized. And maybe if you even go back 30, 40 years ago, people were, especially when there was much less urbanization. And I know you grew up in New York City. Is that right?
In a suburb, Yonkers.
Oh, Yonkers. Okay.
Mhm.
I grew up in Southern California, Orange County. I lived part of my life in more of a blue collar neighborhood where kids played outside, and then we moved to a white collar neighborhood where nobody played outside, and it was like the dads were all at work, and the previous neighborhood the dads would play with us, and so I was probably one of the last generations of kids that actually played outside. I say all that because I feel like there was more of a sense of community, and people would go to their churches and go to their clubs, and my grandparents were in bowling leagues, and there was a lot more of that. People knew each other's neighbors, right? And I lived in San Francisco for 17 years, and I couldn't have told you two of my neighbors' names and they lived next door to me for over a decade. I live here in Austin. I know we actually do know our two next door neighbors, but I don't know that many of my neighbors that well. A little bit better here than in San Francisco. But I guess what I'm saying is I feel like there was probably a time not too distant past where, it took a village what meant something, and people actually raised each other's kids and were more involved in each other's business in that way. And there was that kind of backstop and expectation, and that formulated values that people shared. And I feel like that's not necessarily the case as much now. And people are more decentralized, and they get a lot of their influence and values from their digital interactions, social media, who they meet online. How do we reconcile this if we're trying to bring up great kids?
Well, one thing that I think has to be highlighted in any conversation about values is, how do you achieve good values when you have the kind of economic disparity and the widening economic disparity that we have in this country? So when you put people into a scarcity mindset where lots of people do not have enough, you're going to have people who look at life through a zero-sum lens. And meaning, if I win, you lose. When people feel like they have enough, and I think the kind of community you're describing that used to exist was one where people helped each other enough so that more people did have the feeling of having enough. Right now, we have people competing with each other for things. If I am going to win something, if I'm going to get accepted at something, then you're going to lose. I think that has done more to destroy or undermine the ability to live with good values and teach our kids good values, because they're seeing that world, the zero-sum world, on social media, on big media. They're seeing it in their schools. And it is a massive job for us as parents to interrupt that. But still, the thing that most interrupts it is abundance, and abundance of love, and abundance of faith, and abundance of belief are the antidotes to that scarcity point of view. It's still the single most powerful thing parents can do with their kids.
When you look at, and you just made me think of this, I saw recently, and this is there's a bit of, I think statistically what I'm going to say is true, but there's a bit of a rhetoric coming from more conservative part of the world around, well, there's more, the real issue is that we have way more single unwed parents than ever before right now. And that creates a dilution of the family unit, right? And and the real issue is that we don't have strong values, strong community, and the anecdote is not having that. Now, the cat's out of the bag. I don't know how you can change that unless you culturally change the way people build families and get married and have kids and stuff like that. And maybe we can do that over time. But right now, that doesn't seem to be the case, at least here in the United States, where that's what the family units look like. So I guess, A, do you have thoughts on that? And then B, let's assume that's going to be what it's going to be. Is there a way that we can think about how schools and how community organizations can help maybe surrogate some of the things that we're talking about here? Because there's got to be an answer if we want to build a stronger society.
I think what you're talking about is building a movement, because there is a way that we got to today, that we got to this place of scarcity, of competition, of zero sum values. So the the most powerful antidote is what we do in the relationships of our lives that we have any control over. That's the single most important thing, because we have control over that. I think you then went to the next community, and the community of schools. In my world, lots of schools are wanting to take up the responsibility for building communities of belonging, communities of safety, communities where people are taking responsibility for each other's well-being. And I think that's important work. Then you go up a level, and I think then you have to think about things like the role that you're playing, that there is no media assault yet on this value system that has been so destructive to our country. And one of the things that I plan to be working on is how you change belief systems that people have, how you change the mindsets that they have about what we can change as human beings. And so there have to be ambassadors, there have to be celebrities, there have to be examples, but it's movement building. We didn't get here easily. And you know that if you look at history, there are other times when other values prevailed. We have to fight against this. And I think there's enough worry about it where I think that there is something to galvanize here. So if you were to ask me what my purpose is, it's working on that.
And so, diving one level deeper on that, saying, and I appreciate that this is your purpose. When you start, no worries, it's all right. When you start to talk about it being your purpose and creating a movement, what do you think, if you were to give us kind of help draw that out for me, of how someone could support you in that? If we have listeners, we have a lot of listeners, by the way, who are super high powered entrepreneurs, CEOs, people like of who are renowned that listen to the show. How could someone, if I say, hey, Pam, I want to help, how can they help in making this movement become bigger for what you're trying to accomplish?
Let me speak about it in two levels. One level is a belief that I have that if you understand, if you know that your destiny is not marked by anything, not by the worst thing that ever happened to you, it's not even marked by your DNA and your genome, that we as human beings have a massive amount of control over our destiny, and that this is biologically and psychologically true. There are very few people that haven't known trauma in the last 10 years, very few. So that army, were it mobilized for good, were it mobilized with different messages, were it mobilized to take action and hold oneself accountable. You talked about in your podcast doing the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. It's a decision you get to make every single day. Well, I want to put that kind of power in the hands of people. I want parents to have it so that they say no to schools that are hurting their kids. I want kids to have it on TikTok and whatever medium, because I want to show them the tools that they can use to power their lives forward at a time where they've lost kind of a lot of faith in what they can do in their own lives. So the support I want is largely around help me build a massive communications campaign around what's true about how we become who we become. When I talk with my team, I say, imagine Taylor Swift as a public intellectual on human potential. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what I'm going to work on. And I will work on it with anybody who wants to work on it too.
I love that. My gosh, I'm so excited for all that work. We're coming to the end of the show, and first of all, I really appreciate this conversation. I always get the honor of getting to talk to brilliant people like yourself and to learn from you and to share this with our audience. So first of all, so much gratitude from me for you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us and our audience. So thank you for that. Appreciate you.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
I want to end our show as we always do with our greatness question. And there's been so much greatness shared already on the show, but I'm gonna follow suit and ask you our greatness question, and then we're gonna get wrapped up, and I'll make sure that we get our audience all the information they need so they can learn more about the stuff you're working on. But before we go there, you ready for the greatness question, Pam?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. All right. What is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how did you overcome it?
So the greatest barrier for me is something that I call the shame cloud. The childhood I came out of made me feel dirty, small, without worth. And I think that would have been a kind of toxic virus had it not ended. And it had to end. And it's been a striking thing that the very thing that caused the shame is now something that I regard as one of my greatest powers. And it's the power to communicate. It's the power to engage. It's, if you are old enough to remember the movie When Harry Met Sally and you remember the scene, I want what she's having. That's me. Me today is to get you to want what I'm having and to make you believe that you can have it too.
Love it. Dr. Pamela Cantor, Pam, as we've called you on the show, thank you so much. Anyone that wants to learn more about the stuff you're working on, I mean, obviously we'll put it all in the show notes, but where can they find you? What's the best way to connect? What's the best way to learn more?
It'll be fun. If you go to my website, PamelaCantorMD.com, I have to remember that. It's my personal stories. It's all kinds of videos and tools and wonderful things. And it's got a very, very important set of principles that we've talked about. Unlocking human potential. Trauma is not destiny. We're all different, and it's a beautiful thing.
All right.
That's what the website's about.
Awesome. Guys, we'll put all the information in the show notes, as well as Pam's LinkedIn profile, but www.PamelaCantorMD.com will go in the show notes. Check it out. It's an awesome website. I was there earlier today, and there's such a wealth of information in there to learn so that we can all become the best versions of ourselves, regardless of our circumstances. Pam, so much gratitude from here at the Greatness Machine. I'm such an honor having you and appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you.
Thank you too. All right, everybody. Peace out. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers. And after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.